My name is Emily. I was standing in the back of the ballroom watching 5 tiers of imported vanilla sponge and champagne cream slide slowly onto Jessica's $10,000 designer gown, while 500 guests gasped in unison. It took 3 years of my life to perfect that recipe and only 3 hours of summer humidity to turn her social life into a literal pile of melted goo. Most people think revenge is a dish best served cold, but in my line of work, it is served at exactly 86 degrees F. My name is Emily, and I am a pastry chef. Specifically, I am a structural pastry artist. I don't just bake cakes, I build edible architecture. People pay me 5 figures to create centerpieces for the most exclusive events in the city. It is a stressful job, but I love it because I am good at it. Or at least I was until Jessica came back into my life. I first met Jessica in high school, and she was exactly what you are imagining. She was the girl who would look you up and down, notice your shoes were from a department store, and make sure everyone in the hallway heard her laugh about it. She wasn't just a bully. She was a predator who looked for any spark of joy in someone else and tried to extinguish it. When I started my small bakery after culinary school, she actually showed up just to tell me that my storefront looked cheap. She told me that her family only ate desserts flown in from Paris and that I would probably be out of business by Christmas. 10 years later, my business was thriving, and Jessica was engaged to the son of a local real estate mogul. When Jessica walked into my shop for a wedding consultation, she didn't apologize for the past. She didn't even acknowledge it. She walked in, threw her designer handbag onto my display case, and started barking orders. She told me she wanted a 7-tier cake for her August wedding at the Lakeside Country Club. This was going to be the wedding of the year. The guest list included the governor, CEOs, and every socialite who mattered. She wanted the cake to be covered in intricate sugar flowers that looked like real peas, and she wanted it to stand nearly 5 feet tall without any visible supports. She spent 2 hours telling me how lucky I was that she was choosing me because her influence would make my career. The entitlement was staggering. Jessica demanded 5 different tasting sessions, each time bringing a group of 6 bridesmaids who all wanted something different. They would sit in my shop for hours making a mess, shouting over each other, and criticizing everything. Jessica would take 1 bite of a lemon curd that took me 12 hours to balance and say it tasted like cleaning fluid. Then she would demand I make it again, but with organic lemons sourced from a specific farm in Italy. When I told her that would triple the cost, she rolled her eyes and told me I was being difficult. She would call me at 3 in the morning to change the shade of pink on the sugar petals by half a degree. If I didn't answer, she would leave 10 voicemails calling me unprofessional and threatening to ruin my reputation on social media. The real red flag should have been the contract. Jessica kept delaying the deposit. Every time I brought it up, she had an excuse. Her father was transferring funds, or the wedding planner had the check, or she was just too busy being a bride to worry about petty math. Because I wanted the prestige of this wedding, I made the mistake of starting the work without the full deposit. I spent 2 months handcrafting over 400 sugar flowers. These flowers are made of a delicate sugar paste called gum paste, and they take hours of meticulous work to vein and shade. I was working 18-hour days to meet her demands. Then, 2 weeks before the wedding, the mask completely slipped. Jessica called me into the country club for a final walkthrough. She looked me in the eye and told me she had found a better deal. She said she had talked to the bakery at the local luxury supermarket, and they told her they could do a 7-tier cake for 1/10 of my price. I explained to her that a supermarket bakery doesn't have the equipment or the specialized stabilizers to hold a cake that size in an outdoor tent in the middle of August. She just laughed. She told me I was an overpriced hack and that she wasn't going to pay me a single dime for the work I had already done. When I pointed out that I had already spent $6,000 on ingredients and labor, she told me that was my problem for being a bad business owner. She then had the audacity to ask me for my recipe notes and my specific supply list so she could give them to the supermarket bakers. I was devastated. I went home and looked at the hundreds of sugar flowers I had made, thinking about the thousands of dollars I was now losing. But then I remembered something. Jessica had actually stolen my notebook during the walkthrough. She thought she was being sneaky, slipping it into her bag while I was talking to the florist. That notebook contained my proprietary recipe for a heat-resistant icing stabilizer. It is a very specific chemical balance that keeps heavy buttercream from sliding off a cake in high humidity. However, what Jessica didn't know was that my notebook was a working draft. On the very last page, I had written a correction in red ink. The original formula in that book was a failure I had tested a year ago. If you used the ratio written in the main chapter without the red ink correction, the icing would look perfect for exactly 2 hours. But as soon as it hit 85 degrees, a chemical reaction would occur between the acidity of the lemon curd and the calcium in the butter. It wouldn't just melt, it would turn into a slippery, soapy liquid. I realized Jessica hadn't seen the correction because the pages were stuck together. She had handed a recipe for disaster to a supermarket team that didn't know any better. I could have called her. I could have warned the other bakery. But as I looked at the photo of my mother on my desk, the mother Jessica had mocked for being a simple home cook. I decided to let the chemistry do the talking. I decided I was going to attend that wedding as a guest of the groom's aunt, who happened to be my best client, and I was going to watch the laws of science take their revenge. The weeks following the contract cancellation were some of the darkest days I had ever experienced in my professional life. Most people think that when a client fires you, the relationship just ends. But Jessica was not a normal client. She was a woman who felt that her status gave her the right to destroy anything she couldn't own. It started with a coordinated social media attack. 2 days after she walked away with my notebook and refused to pay for the hundreds of hours of labor I had invested, I began receiving notifications every few seconds. Jessica had gone onto every local review platform from Yelp to Google to the city's wedding forums and posted a long fabricated story. She claimed that she found a live cockroach in one of my tasting samples. She posted photos of a moldy cake that clearly came from a different shop, claiming it was my work. My rating dropped from 5 stars to 2 stars in 48 hours. I sat in my kitchen staring at the screen, my hands shaking. I tried to reach out to her calmly. I sent a professional email stating that I would be happy to sign a non-disclosure agreement and even waive the remaining labor fees if she would simply remove the false reviews and return my proprietary notebook. Her response was a single photo sent to my personal phone. It was a picture of her and her bridesmaids at a bar using my handcrafted sugar pays as garnishes for their cocktails. She had taken the delicate art I spent months on and treated it like trash. Her caption read, "These taste like cardboard, just like your career." I didn't respond. I knew that every word I sent would just be fuel for her fire. But the harassment didn't stay online. About a week later, I was at the Lakeside Country Club meeting with Alice. Alice is the groom's aunt and a woman of incredible grace and wealth who had been my most loyal client for 5 years. She was the one who had recommended me for the wedding in the first place, and she felt terrible about how Jessica was acting. While we were sitting in the club's terrace cafe discussing an upcoming charity gala, Jessica appeared. She was there for a dress fitting and spotted us. She didn't just walk by. She stopped at our table, looked at the sketch Alice was holding, and laughed. She told Alice that she shouldn't trust a baker who gets fired from the biggest wedding of the year. Jessica then leaned over and intentionally spilled a glass of red wine across the white tablecloth, letting it splash onto my lap. She didn't even pretend it was an accident. She just smiled and said that the stain matched my cheap personality. Then she walked away. Alice was horrified. She apologized profusely for her nephew's choice in a bride and told me right then that she wanted me to be her +1 to the wedding. She told me she wanted me there to see that I was still part of their social circle, but I had a different reason for wanting to go. The final straw happened when I decided to visit the luxury supermarket bakery that Jessica had hired. I told myself I was going there to be a bigger person and offer them a warning about the stability of the cake. But deep down, I wanted to see if they were actually using my stolen notes. When I walked into their prep area, I saw 3 decorators, looking stressed and confused. On the counter, open to the page with the failed recipe, was my notebook. They were trying to mix a massive batch of what I called the slippery icing. Because they were a high-volume supermarket bakery, they didn't have the specialized chemistry knowledge to realize that the proportions were fundamentally broken. One of the decorators looked at me and asked if I was the consultant Jessica mentioned. Jessica had told them she had an expert engineer on call, and they assumed I was her. I saw the notebook. I saw the recipe for the icing that I knew would fail. I looked at the lead decorator, a young girl who looked like she was about to cry from the pressure Jessica was putting on them. I asked her how it was going. She told me that the bride was calling every hour, screaming that the cake wasn't tall enough and that the icing needed to be whiter. Jessica had demanded they add a specific whitening agent to the buttercream. In my notebook, I had a note about that agent. It was a highly acidic titanium dioxide derivative. When mixed with the failed stabilizer already in the recipe, it created a chemical chain reaction that would cause the fat molecules in the butter to completely separate from the liquids once the temperature hit 80 degrees. The decorator asked me, "Does this recipe look right to you?" This was my moment. I could have told her the truth. I could have told her that the icing was going to turn into a soapy sludge the moment it left the refrigerator. But then I remembered the wine on my clothes, the fake cockroach reviews, and the sight of my father's memory being mocked. I looked the girl in the eye and said, "It looks like it needs more of the whitener. In fact, if you want it to really shine under the outdoor lights, you should double the acidity." I even reached into my bag and handed her a small container of concentrated citric acid that I happened to have for my lemon tarts. I told her it was a special secret to make the champagne flavor pop. I wasn't just letting them fail anymore, I was accelerating the process. Jessica had spent months treating everyone around her like foot tools. During the rehearsals, she was reportedly even worse. She made her bridesmaids weigh themselves every morning. She fired a florist because the roses were the wrong shade of white. She was so blinded by her own ego and her stolen recipe that she never once stopped to think that she had pushed a professional too far. She believed she had won. She believed she had stolen my brilliance for a fraction of the price and destroyed my name in the process. She was so busy being the queen of the city that she didn't realize she was building her throne on a foundation of melting butter and chemical reactions. The day before the Yaz's wedding, the humidity in the city spiked. A heat wave was rolling in, and the weather report predicted 90 degrees by mid-afternoon. The wedding was an outdoor tent ceremony on the country club lawn. No air conditioning, just the sun, the moisture from the lake, and 500 lb of unstable chemistry. Alice called me that night and asked if I was still coming. I told her I wouldn't miss it for the world. I told her I was bringing a very special gift for the bride, though I didn't tell her the gift was simply my silence. I spent that evening at home peacefully baking a small, perfect cake for myself, knowing that by the next evening, Jessica would finally understand the true cost of my labor. The morning of the wedding arrived with a suffocating heat that felt like a physical weight against my chest. I was sitting in my shop trying to focus on a small order of macaroons when I heard the chime above my door. I looked up, expecting a regular customer, but instead I saw Jessica standing there in her pre-wedding silk robe, clutching a coffee cup and looking like she was vibrating with a manic, toxic energy. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be at the country club getting her hair and makeup done. Behind her stood two of her bridesmaids, looking exhausted and terrified. Jessica didn't say hello. She walked straight to my display counter and tapped on the glass with her heavy diamond engagement ring, leaving tiny scuffs on the surface. She told me she was there for a final victory lap. She said she wanted to see my face one last time before she became the most powerful socialite in the county. Then she saw the framed photo on the shelf behind me. It was a picture of me and my father at my culinary school graduation. My father had passed away only 6 months ago. He was the one who had mortgaged his house to help me open this bakery. He was the one who taught me that integrity was the most important ingredient in any recipe. Jessica reached over the counter, grabbed the frame, and looked at it with a sneer. She asked me if this was the man who taught me how to be a failure. Before I could even process the words, she let the frame drop. It didn't just fall. She threw it downward onto the hard tile floor. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, slicing right through the center of the photograph across my father's face. I stood there frozen, the sound of the breaking glass echoing in the small shop. One of the bridesmaids gasped and reached out a hand, but Jessica just laughed. She stepped on the remains of the frame, grinding her heel into the photo. She leaned over the counter and whispered that she had just received a call from the city health inspector. She told me she had used her father-in-law's connections to file a formal complaint about a fake salmonella outbreak linked to my shop. She said that by the time she was cutting her wedding cake, my doors would be padlocked by the city and my name would be headlines in the local news for poisoning people. She told me I was nothing, that my father was nothing, and that today was the day I would finally disappear. She turned around and walked out, leaving the smell of her expensive perfume and the wreckage of my most precious memory behind. That was the moment the last shred of my restraint snapped. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I knelt down and carefully picked up the torn pieces of the photo. I realized then that I had been playing a game of professional ethics with a woman who didn't even have a soul. I had tried to be the bigger person. I had tried to let the chemistry fail on its own. But now it wasn't just about a cake or a contract. It was about the fact that Jessica believed she could destroy people's lives and memories for sport. I looked at the small container of the extra acidic whitening agent I had on my bench. I realized that the special ingredient I had given the supermarket bakers was good, but I could make it more effective. I knew the head of the country club's maintenance team, a man named Dave, whose daughter I had baked a birthday cake for every year for free. I called Dave. I didn't ask him to sabotage anything. I just asked him what the temperature settings were for the reception tent. He told me that Jessica had been screaming at him all morning because she didn't want the loud hum of the industrial fans ruining her aesthetic. She had ordered the maintenance crew to turn off the auxiliary cooling units until the speeches were over. She wanted the tent to be silent and natural. Dave told me the temperature inside the tent was already hitting 85 degrees, and the sun hadn't even reached its peak yet. I told Dave I was coming by to drop off a stability gift for the catering team. I drove to the country club, my heart beating with a cold, steady rhythm. When I arrived, the chaos was everywhere. Florists were sweating, waiters were rushing, and in the center of the service tent stood the monster. It was the 7-tier cake covered in the stolen recipe of white buttercream. It looked beautiful from a distance, but as I got closer, I could see the signs. The icing had a slight oily sheen to it. That was the separation beginning. The supermarket bakers were panicked. They told me the cake was starting to lean. They asked me if I had that secret stabilizer I promised. I handed them a bottle labeled as a professional floral stiffener. In reality, it was a concentrated enzyme used in large-scale dairy processing to break down fats. In a normal cake, it would be a disaster. In a cake already struggling with high acidity and extreme heat, it was a detonator. I told them to spray it liberally over the tiers to lock in the moisture. They thanked me, calling me a lifesaver. I watched them mist the entire 7FT structure with the liquid that would ensure the butter molecules lost all grip on the sponge layers. As I walked out of the service tent, I ran into Alice. She saw the look in my eyes and pulled me aside. She asked me if I was okay. I told her that I had just realized that some things are meant to fall apart so that something better can be built in their place. Alice looked at the tent, then back at me, and a small, knowing smile played on her lips. She had seen Jessica's behavior all morning. She had seen Jessica slap a waitress for serving the wrong brand of sparkling water. Alice told me to go home, change into my best dress, and meet her at the entrance in 2 hours. She told me she wanted me to have a front row seat for the festivities. I went back to my shop, cleaned up the broken glass, and placed the torn photo of my father in my locket. I put on a deep red silk dress, a color that screamed for attention. I wasn't going as a victim. I wasn't going as a disgruntled baker. I was going as the witness to an inevitable law of nature. Jessica thought she had used her power to crush me, but she had actually just removed every reason I had to show her mercy. The heat outside continued to rise, the humidity thick enough to blur the horizon. I could almost feel the chemical bonds in that tent breaking apart. The stage was set. The guests were arriving and the fuse was already burning. The preparation for the final act required the precision of a watchmaker and the cold detachment of a surgeon. I knew that simply letting the cake melt wasn't enough to satisfy the debt Jessica owed me. I needed her to lose more than just the centerpiece. I needed her to lose the one thing she valued above all else, which was her ironclad grip on her social standing and her father-in-law's bottomless bank account. While the enzymes and acids were doing their silent work in the heat of the tent, I spent the afternoon finalizing the digital side of the trap. I sat at my laptop and compiled every single piece of evidence I had been gathering since the day she first walked into my shop. I had saved every 3 a.m. voicemail where she threatened to use her family's political connections to falsify health reports. I had every email where she admitted she was intentionally withholding my deposit to force me into bankruptcy so she could buy my equipment at an auction for pennies. Most importantly, I had a high-resolution video from my shop's security camera. It wasn't just the footage of her breaking my father's photo, it was the audio that followed. The camera had captured her bragging to her bridesmaids about how she had funneled thousands of dollars of her fiancé's wedding budget into a private offshore account, and how she was planning to divorce him within 2 years once the prenuptial agreement reached its first payout milestone. She had laughed about how easy it was to Manipulate the groom's family because they were desperate for the image of a perfect union. I packaged these files into a single password-protected folder and wrote a scheduled release script. If I didn't check in by midnight, the folder would be sent to the groom, his father, and the local news station that was already covering the wedding of the year. But I didn't want to wait for midnight. I wanted the reveal to coincide with the physical collapse of her vanity. I arrived at the country club as Alice's guest, looking every bit the successful professional she had tried to destroy. I carried a small, elegantly wrapped gift box. Inside wasn't a gift for Jessica, but a specialized tablet preloaded with the video of her confession in my shop set to play on a loop. I moved through the crowd of 500 elite guests like a ghost. The heat under the massive white tent was unbearable. Jessica had insisted on heavy plastic side panels to keep the view of the lake framed perfectly, which turned the interior into a literal greenhouse. I walked past the cake, and even from 10 ft away, I could smell the disaster. The champagne cream was beginning to ferment in the heat, giving off a sharp, sickly sweet odor. The structural integrity was failing. The enzymes I had provided were systematically dismantling the protein chains in the dairy. The 5-FT structure was vibrating ever so slightly as the bottom layers began to compress under the weight of the tiers above. It was a ticking bomb made of sugar and spite. I spotted the groom's father, Mr. Miller, standing near the bar. He was the one who had funded this entire charade. I approached him with a smile and handed him the gift box. I told him it was a digital tribute to the bride's true character and that he should watch it privately before the cake-cutting ceremony to ensure he understood the legacy his family was joining. I knew his curiosity and his protective nature over the family fortune would do the rest of the work. As he walked toward the quiet of the clubhouse library to open the box, I made my way to the back of the tent to find Dave, the maintenance lead. I asked Dave if the audio system was linked to the club's central server. He nodded, looking stressed. I handed him a thumb drive and told him it was the backing track for the bride's surprise montage. Jessica had told the staff she had a surprise for the groom, so Dave didn't question it. He plugged it in, ready to hit play when the master of ceremonies gave the signal. The track on that drive wasn't music. It was the audio recording of Jessica mocking the groom's family and describing them as clueless ATM machines while she ground her heel into my father's memory. The final piece of the trap was the cake itself. I knew that the supermarket decorators had used a heavy internal plastic dowel system they had found in my notes. However, they had used the ones I had marked as defective in the back of the book. Those dowels were made of a biodegradable polymer that was designed to dissolve when exposed to high acidity. By encouraging them to double the citric acid and the whitening agent, I had guaranteed that the supports were currently being eaten away from the inside out. The cake wasn't just melting, its bones were disappearing. I took my seat next to Alice. She leaned in and whispered that the atmosphere felt electric. I told her it was just the humidity. I watched Jessica. She was at the head table, glowing with a sense of triumph that made my skin crawl. She was screaming at a server because the champagne wasn't cold enough, oblivious to the fact that her entire world was about 10 minutes away from a total phase change. I looked at my watch. The sun was hitting the peak of the tent and the temperature inside had to be 95 degrees. The sugar flowers I had made, the ones she had stolen and forced the supermarket to glue onto the cake with cheap corn syrup, were the only things holding the exterior together. They were like a skin holding in a gallon of liquid. I saw Mr. Miller emerge from the clubhouse. His face wasn't just red, it was a deep, terrifying purple. He was clutching the tablet I had given him, and he was walking straight toward the head table. At the same moment, the MC stepped to the microphone and announced that it was time for the surprise tribute, followed by the cutting of the cake. The lights dimmed and the giant projection screen behind the cake stand lowered. The guests went silent, expecting a romantic slideshow. Instead, the speakers roared to life with Jessica's voice, crystal clear and unmistakable, explaining exactly how she intended to bleed the Miller family dry. I stood up and smoothed out my red dress. The trap was sprung. The digital collapse was happening in the ears of 500 people, and the physical collapse was happening right behind the bride's head. I didn't need to do anything else. I just needed to watch the laws of science and the weight of a person's own actions finally catch up to them. The silence that followed the first 10 seconds of the audio recording was more deafening than the heat. Jessica stood frozen at the head table, her fork halfway to her mouth as her own voice boomed through the high-end speaker system of the country club. She was caught in mid-sentence describing the Miller family as a collection of arrogant trust fund idiots she couldn't wait to rob. The guests sat in stunned horror. Mr. Miller reached the head table just as the audio reached the part where Jessica laughed about the offshore accounts and her 2-year divorce plan. He didn't say a word. He simply placed the tablet on the table in front of his son and stared at his soon-to-be daughter-in-law with a look of pure, unadulterated coldness.